I was a journalist for more than 30 years, 16 years in New York at the Wall Street Journal, managing editor of Forbes for almost a decade. Boom, moving to television because that's what I wanted most of all, man. I wanted TV. I wanted an audience. I wanted to meet women and I wanted better tables in restaurants. And so I go to CNBC for 3 years. They make me an anchor. It's fantastic. I'm so happy. And then they decide, you're just not an anchor. So even though you now have 3 years of TV experience as an anchor, we want to cut your salary 35, 40% and, renew your contract. I left. I went to Fox. I was an anchor there and I'm there for 3 years and I'm loving it. And suddenly I left with 15 minutes notice. So I know a lot about both places and I love both places in many ways. And the thing about television that we have to remember is we can't take it too seriously. It's just kind of squirrel television. It's like the next squirrel. Now I was this print guy for years, right? And I prided myself on fact and stat-based opinion. And so I rigorously report and try to get all that information out there. And I had this right in the wake of the meltdown, 2009, for like 6 months, my own 8:00 at night solo anchor show at CNBC. This was my goal. This was why I quit Forbes magazine and did it. And it lasted, 6 months, and then they canceled it and they got higher ratings with porn or whatever. But what happens in running with, documentaries about porn, documentaries about pot, I mean, they ran reruns and they got triple the audience. And I understand the decision, but I was one of the only voices in 2009 saying, buy stocks. Our best days are ahead of us. Let's sell the hope, because investment in capitalism, capitalism is optimism monetized. You invest because you believe good things are happening.
Welcome to the Futures Edge podcast. I'm Jim Muriel. As always, the brains behind the operation. But the reason we're laughing, people, is me trying to figure out the technology of this bullshit ahead of time has frustrated everybody involved. So we're going to try to get by that. But Bob Iacchino, executive producer, co-host, and an old friend who I'm very excited about talking to on the show today, Dennis Kneale, the host of the What's Bugging Me podcast, which sounds like that should be the name of my podcast. Something is always bugging me. Thank you for coming, Dennis. So let me explain the ground rules to you, by the way. If we start to talk about things you don't want to talk about, or we ask you questions, whatever, just tell us what you want to talk about. This is informal as you get, but thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, good. It's great to see. I'm so glad to join you. You've come on the pod a couple times and you've always had such interesting stuff to say, because, people, they see what happens in the stock market, but you see the people underneath and it's so much the people and the emotion, isn't it? And we continually are surprised by what's been going on in the markets. NASDAQ up 10% this month. Who would have thunk it? Except any optimist out there. And I'm happy to see it. I got to tell you. I mean, of course, always we're waiting for the next, correction, next crash, and even more so.
Yeah, and I do worry, and not necessarily the rally in general, but the economic condition I am worried somewhat about. I'm worried that several of the auctions of the U.S. selling debt have gone poorly over the last couple months. I'm worried that Bitcoin and gold are going through the roof, which I've owned both of them and have owned them all year and have explained to people why I've sold them. But let's talk about something that I think is very interesting. So on this podcast, we talk about markets. We do deep dives into macro economics, which I love. But also, we talk about the general landscape of the nonsense and the bullshit that's going on. And on your podcast, I know that you focus a lot on the nonsense and the bullshit, the suppression, you and I both work together at that station, which I don't like to mention its name, which seemed to want to get rid of everybody who had a different viewpoint. Can you speak to that at all?
And they have. And in fact, could I just cut right into a detail, okay? Think about this.
Hell yeah.
This morning, above the fold, Wall Street Journal, okay? Above the fold, about this big problem with ads on Instagram running next to sexual content. When you look at a cheerleader, you end up finding, oh my gosh, you're led to people who follow child porn type of stuff. Now, it's a front page story. And I waited almost an hour and 45 minutes before that became a headline in an interview on CNBC this morning. Now, cut back to the controversy a few days ago over, oh my gosh, ads for Apple and IBM, et cetera, are running next to Nazi content on Twitter. That became a story that CNBC was flagging like crazy. Every time another advertiser said, yes, we're leaving, 6 advertisers left, another headline on a company that's privately held, that a stock, there's no stock holding at all. You guys are covering that like crazy. You know, Elon's an anti-Semite. But then today this happens, and it turns out publicly held Meta has a platform, Instagram, that has a problem. And suddenly you're waiting an hour and 40 minutes into your Squawk Box to get to it. And it was on page 1 of the Journal that morning. Why the difference, except that the media, they hate Elon Musk because his X platform is going to obviate them and make them basically superfluous.
One of the things I wanted to bring up, Dennis, I'm glad you brought it up. And just so you guys know, I'll mention the station unless you don't want me to, because I was on there as well. And I was a contributor as one of the Futures Now traders. And my story, Dennis, is very simple. They asked me to cover crude oil on the segment I was going to be on that day. I prepped for crude oil. I don't need much prepping for crude oil. I traded all day. But last second, they turned to me and they said, hey, we're covering copper. It's up 7%. We want you to have a copper trade. I said, well, I'm not trading copper up 7%. They said, well, we need you to have a trade. I said, I don't have a trade. It's up 7%. Either I'm buying it while it's screaming or I'm selling it and I'm going to get smacked in the face by it. Because usually when things go up, they continue to go up. We all know that. And when I went on, they said, you have to have a trade. I said, okay, fine, I'll have a trade. When I went on, I said, copper's up 7%. If it falls 6.8%, I might buy it. That was my trade. They got so pissed at me. I mean, the producers called me afterwards and I said, you know what? Why don't you guys not schedule with me anymore? I have a contract with you guys. I will fill in until that contract is up. But we're done. I don't want to do this with you guys because I look like the asshole if I tell somebody to buy it up 7% or to go ahead and sell it because it's up 7%, which is what they wanted me to do. I'm digressing a little bit. One of the things that bothers me about them, to your point, Dennis, they're the TMZ of financial media as far as I'm concerned. And I always use the example, the late, great Jack Bogle, who you spoke to many times on the show, is creator of Vanguard. He's kind of credited as being the founder of the index fund, right?
Yeah.
He used to come on all the time and talk about buy and hold, don't try to time the market. And a couple of minutes later, they would put on a show called Fast Money.
Right.
And I never understood how you could put those two together in one place.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to your frustration being there when you were trying to provide alternative viewpoints?
A lot of your listeners, man, have no idea who I am. So so they know out there real quick, I was a journalist for more than 30 years, 16 years in New York at the Wall Street Journal, managing editor of Forbes for almost a decade, boom, moving to television because that's what I wanted most of all, man. I wanted TV. I wanted an audience. I wanted to meet women and I wanted better tables in restaurants. And so I go to CNBC for 3 years. They make me an anchor. It's fantastic. I'm so happy. And then they decide, you're just not an anchor. So even though you now have 3 years of TV experience as an anchor, we want to cut your salary 35, 40% and, renew your contract. I left. I went to Fox. I was an anchor there and I'm there for 3 years and I'm loving it. And suddenly I left with 15 minutes notice. So I know a lot about both places and I love both places in many ways. And the thing about television that we have to remember is we can't take it too seriously. It's just kind of squirrel television. It's like the next squirrel, and that's what happened with your segment and into the next thing. And if they only focused on buy and hold, it'd be the most boring programming ever. And so instead it becomes kind of person, learn how to adapt to that environment and work with it. Now, I was this print guy for years, right? And I prided myself on fact and stat-based opinion. And so I rigorously report and try to get all that information out there. And I had this right in the wake of the meltdown, 2009, for like 6 months, my own 8:00 at night solo anchor show at CNBC. This was my goal. This was why I quit Forbes magazine and did it. And it lasted, 6 months, and then they canceled it, and they got higher ratings with porn or whatever. But what happens in running with, documentaries about porn, documentaries about pot? I mean, they ran reruns and they got triple the audience. And I understand the decision, but I was one of the only voices in 2009 saying, buy stocks. Our best days are ahead of us. Let's sell the hope, because investment and capitalism, capitalism is optimism monetized. You invest because you believe good things are happening. Now, we just saw, and I realize I'm kind of a circuitous answer, Bob, and I'll get right back to your question in a minute.
Please keep
Just
going.
saw
You're
Jim
there to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
we saw Jim Chanos hang up the shing. I mean, go out of business. $6 billion in '08 down to $200 million on short selling in the longest running bull market of all time. Poor guy. He went short China and lost money for 3 years. His ultimate Moby Dick for this Ahab, Jim Chanos, was Tesla, because you make more money over the long run by betting on the upside for rank and file investors, not by betting on doom. So all of that. So I'm selling the hope during that, but I realized you needed controversy. You needed to start a fight in an empty room, and TV requires that. And I had a little too much controversy and too much conflict, maybe. But the thing is, on television, everybody who goes on television is afraid of being wrong. And so when you're afraid of being wrong, you err on the side of caution. Here's an example, Bob. In the last 12 months or 11 months, CNBC has had stories on cracks in the consumer and used that phrase at least 6 different times, as recently as November 20th. But in Black Friday sales, we just had sales up 7.5%, online 9.8 billion, one of the biggest number ever. There are no cracks in this consumer. All of the experts have been wrong. And the thing is, when you're an expert who gets paid to give your financial advice to people, people get really mad at you when they lose money. They don't get as mad at you when they miss out on an upside opportunity, right? So therefore, the bias on all cable television, cable news, business cable is negative, is scary. It's worried about recession. I mean, I predicted over a year ago, I think in July 2020, there ain't going to be no recession. And there hasn't been. Now, there will be eventually. We got to have it eventually, don't we? I mean, it's just cyclical. How long can we have this inverted yield curve? It's been months and months now. Longest, I'm sure, on record without a recession. It's just that all of those numbers now are totally inflated by COVID and Fed and weird stuff. So maybe the old stats don't apply. What do you guys think? Are we headed for recession finally? I've been saying no for over almost 2 years.
Well, really quick, if I could, I remember so I left. I shouldn't say I left because I was never a part of it, but I stopped appearing on that network long before Jimmy. And I remember about 8 or 9 months after I stopped appearing, Jimmy snarked at me. He goes, "I may be right behind you." But I remember one of the times I thought Jimmy's going to leave next. I was actually on with Jimmy. And Jimmy, the only part of this you probably remember is arguing about who was taller. But in that particular little 4-minute, 5-minute segment, whatever it was, I was saying something and I heard them say in our ears, "Jim, we want to argue this point." To your point about a fight in an empty room. And when they came to Jimmy, he goes, "I think Bobby's right." They didn't like that at all. They didn't like that one bit. Because why would he fight if he agrees with me? We fight enough.
It's TV, right? By the way, I'm taller, just to be clear.
But conflict and drama and struggle are these 3 elements of a great story. You need kind of disagreement. I used to make jokes like that as an anchor all the time. Someone would say, "I agree with the other guest." And I said, "No, that's not allowed. You want to have some kind of contrast, right?" Look, there's another thing also, though, going on. One time I'm there at CNBC. I'll just say it. And I'm there with Larry Kudlow, whom I love. He was a mentor of mine. He kind of helped bring me to CNBC. And I'm just there brand new. And the markets are going, it's October 07. Suddenly the worst meltdown in decades is beginning. And everyone's so pessimistic. I'm saying to Larry before we're doing a hit and we've got mics, I'm saying, they're so panicked here. And I got to tell you, I think we're going to be okay. It doesn't have to be the word. You almost talked to, I'm saying that. He says, I said, "I think it's because they just want to protect people and they're afraid." He said, "That's not it." And he writes down, because he's on mic, he doesn't want them to see, just writes liberals, underscore, right? They hate Bush. And that,
Can I ask you
never
both
thought
something?
there was a political component guiding the coverage. But since I've left the media and been outside of it, it's gotten more slanted. Trump broke them. And they now are showing their talons and showing their bias, whereas they used to at least try to hide it. And they're more liberal and more shameless shills than I've ever seen before. I was quiet about it for years. I saw it happen. I didn't say a word because I was hoping they would hire me back. I mean, I waited for the offers to pour in. Nothing happened. It was so weird because I thought I was fantastic on air on CNBC and Fox. Nothing came in, and I stayed quiet. But then once I decided I'm getting this podcast, I'm speaking out about what's bugging me, and my former colleagues have gone crazy And I'm ashamed at what's happened to the media and how slanted they've become. And it's hurt America because we no longer on either side of the aisle have a belief in kind of a worked out version of the truth. We now believe everything has a slant to it, and everything does have a slant to it, it seems like.
Can I ask you both something if I could, Jimmy?
Sure.
I want to ask you guys because, and I want to get back to your recession question. I'm sure Jimmy does too, but you mentioned Larry Kudlow, and you guys are friends with him. I have been on with him maybe 5-6 times. I wish it were 500. I love the guy. But I'm not friends with him like you two guys are.
Yeah.
And one of the funny things is, in terms of being positive, has there ever been anyone more positive about the American exceptionalism, the American economy than Larry? Which kind of does am I wrong about that, or does that not prove the point that it's left versus right rather than positive versus negative?
Yeah, maybe it's pro-America versus pro-America's flaws. But he like drill baby drill. I mean, that was the right prescription, and that did great things for the economy during the Trump era, and then suddenly went to a screeching halt during Biden. He really does believe in America, and that's the thing. I mean, that kind of optimism, without being naive, because it's got to be a fact-based optimism, but it's such an important ingredient to the entire investing formula, isn't it, Jim?
Oh, there's no question, and I think he and I have argued about. I believe his needle trends toward optimism, which interestingly, that's been right. I mean, America has always recovered from everything that's been thrown at it in our entire lifetime so far. And that's interesting to me, and I do appreciate that. I like to think my arrow starts, at zero, which it doesn't. Every trader believes their arrow starts at zero, and then you let the data push it around. But I think I lean more towards optimism too. I know probably a lot of people listening to this are going, "Do you lean more toward optimism?" That's bullshit. No, I think I do. I just say it in a very nasty way sometimes, and I believe that logic will win out. But as far as Larry goes, remember, Larry was, and a lot of people think of him as a talking head. Larry was an absolute rock star economist when he was on Wall Street. Like he was the up and comer. He was great and a very, very bright guy. So his optimism has proved to be right. But we've had a ton of arguments regarding it.
Yeah.
I've always seen Larry as the one who I kind of scoffed at because he always thought the U.S. was going to recover. And he always thought the economy would come back to that. And it actually brings us around to your question about the recession, Dennis, because for me, I don't think it's a matter. Timing a recession has proven extremely difficult. Predicting one has proven extremely easy. And I think one has to come, as you said, and I think it's inevitable that one comes sooner rather than later. But guess what? As time moves forward, my sooner becomes more right because we get closer every time the minutes pass. So it's one of those things that's impossible to be wrong. But I want to throw in, I don't care. One of the things that people and TV specifically obsess over, and Jimmy, you know this because they ask you about it all the time, is there going to be a recession? Here's the thing. Stocks move higher once a recession starts. There's an initial dip after the inverted yield curve goes positive, and that's the bottom of stocks historically. It hasn't happened every time, but it's happened about 92% of the time. So when a recession happens, hooray from an investor standpoint.
Right.
It's kind of difficult for people who are losing their jobs, but as an investor, I mean, hooray.
Yes. And let's remember that some of the most successful startups of all time have started during recession. I mean, it goes back to HP. Okay. I mean, in the hardest times, people get laid off and then they suddenly try new things that they might not have tried. So out of bad things, good things can happen, these green shoots. And when I first went to CNBC and everything started falling apart, I was the one voice of the network saying in production meetings, news meetings, hey, man, wait a minute. And we started talking more about green shoots just to look for that upside. And the weird thing I learned during that crisis, because 07, 08, when the meltdown looked worse, was the one time in my entire 30 plus years of following business and markets that I was afraid for what would happen. Okay. Because were they going to blow this? But then I learned this, that when the entire world is in trouble, the money floods to the one place that is the least risky, that is the strongest, even in a world on fire. And that is the US. So the weird thing is that even if we set off a global contagion of market crash or whatever, eventually it ends up accruing to our benefit because the money comes back here because we are the biggest, strongest, most vibrant, most creative economy in the world.
Can I bring some negativity back to this discussion right now where it belongs? No, I appreciate both of those things. But one thing that Bobby said to me a couple months ago, which I think is playing out perfectly, is that a lot of union contracts were negotiated. A lot of people think they have money. There's a lot of money that's still been injected into the system. I did think, because of Bobby's convincing of me, that the holiday season was going to be good and it was going to be somewhat of a last hurrah. There are, I hate to say this, Dennis, because I heard what you said, but there are cracks in the consumer, particularly low-end consumer. Just today, I was looking at the statistics for borrowing money from one's 401k. You don't generally do that unless you're feeling stressed out. The statistic about 65% of American households not being prepared for a $2,000.
What was the first stat? What percentage are borrowing and how much is it up? Borrowing from
401k was up like 30% from last year. I don't know what the specific statistics about.
Okay, that's a concern. Go ahead.
It's a concern. Credit card debt, a concern, particularly when it's being financed at ridiculous high rates. The statistic about households not having $2,000 for an expense. These are big deals to me. Like, I think we pushed off this recession far because $7 trillion was injected into the economy in response to COVID mitigation strategies. And of that, some of it's been taken out. There's still a crap ton that's left out there. Now, the top 25% is who really has that money. But at the restaurant I own, which is a wildly successful restaurant, and it was before I bought it, except they had problems with cocaine and racehorses and they weren't making money. But once we solved those problems, because those are generally not a good mix for a restaurant.
Pretty easy to solve, too.
Pretty easy to solve, too. Stop doing cocaine and stop buying racehorses. Point being is that over the last 6 weeks, we have seen a marked difference in what people order. And we're in a relatively affluent area. We have a mix, but probably half of the people who come to our restaurant are affluent. And people are making different decisions regarding what to buy. Buying
Lower
less
price.
appetizers, less, maybe not a third drink.
They also have Christmas shopping coming up.
Okay, yeah, but I'm comparing that against last year's numbers at the same time period. So, so that I think something is changing, and I do think recession towards the end of Q1. And to Bobby's point, it is silly, except for clicks, to be picking a recession, because you mentioned that stocks do well in a recession, Bobby, and that is because that we have an activist Fed since the 80s that comes in with loads of money. Now they'll say, "Oh no, we're not coming in with any sort of help." Bullshit. And everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think the Fed will reverse QT, will maybe even buy bonds sometime in 2024.
You can start cutting by March, and then the market's like that. I got a couple stats for you, though, to add to what you said.
Good.
I've been wondering one worry I've had, guys, is that Keynesian economics, which I've always opposed, the idea that government can spend whatever it wants to stimulate the economy. I worried that this is a real life experience since COVID, and that Keynesian has been working. That's why we had a 4.9% GDP second quarter number. Okay, but during that $2 trillion in direct aid that went out for COVID, I did some calculations. It was $1.2 trillion to businesses, and then $800 billion to consumers. Now, the $800 billion worked out to, for a family of four with two earners, two taxpayers in the family, it's $11,500 in 13 months in cash went to that family. That where the median savings in America was $5,100. So you had more than doubling of the median savings in America that went to a family of four, and where 40% of households, the Fed said, don't have $400 for an emergency. So that money comes in. And obviously now, previously, all of the quantitative easing, I remember when we were recovering from the last meltdown, and we kept wondering, where's the inflation? Where's the inflation? It's because the money had no velocity, right? It wasn't coming into the economy. It was getting just sucked up by instruments. But now we see consumers, they are spending. They had that tripling, really, of median income, because if you're at 5,100 and you get 11,500 on top, it's now at 60. I mean, you've tripled the 5,100, and so that's been going great. At some point, though, that does kind of have to run out of air, doesn't it?
Well, you just to put to your point too, is they injected that money into the economy to keep demand constant. At the same time, supply chains were completely locked up. So this is day one stuff in Econ 101. It's just a relationship between supply and demand. Supply was going down because of that, and they kept demand steady. So this was no great surprise that inflation was happening. And when they sit back and like, who could have predicted this? That's bullshit. We all could have predicted it, and we screamed it at them. From the mountaintops, we screamed that at him, explaining in great detail.
I know what I wanted to ask you guys. How much of this next thing do you think happened? I'm a manufacturer or a service seller. man, there's been resistance to any price or fee increase for years. Now we have the COVID crisis, the war in Russia, Ukraine. We have all these facts. We now have an excuse to raise prices beyond what our costs really have gone up. Because while some things have gone up 30%, a lot of the stuff we buy in our particular business isn't up. But that's in the headline. So now let's all come in, raise it more than we actually what justified to or needed to. But now that we're up there, even if inflation comes down, will we see prices go back down, or will they stay there? And now it goes, we have a new base. And that is going to hurt growth in the next couple of years if that's the way it goes. What do you think?
So really quick, I was talking to another restaurant owner who happens to be my brother. We talked about him before we on the recording earlier. I was talking to him the other day, and he asked me to send him a chart of the Fed funds rate and inflation. And he's kind of an amateur economist. He's a pretty good one too, but he owns a restaurant, bakery, deli, out sort of near Jimmy's restaurant, but far enough away where they don't compete. But he said to me the other day that a customer came in and said, all right, so inflation is down when our price is going down. And my brother said, they're not.
Right?
He said, they're not going back down. He goes, help me explain to these guys why. And my answer was to send him a chart of the actual consumer price index. And Jimmy and I talk about this all the time. It's an index, okay? What people see is the rate of change of that index. Go look at the consumer price index going all the way back to however far the St. Louis Fed prints it. I think it goes back to 1960. The only dips are recessions. It never dips. It's straight up all the time. Yeah. Prices are always rising. So the example I like to give is the $30,000 car in 2019 that became $38,000 as we got through the inflation rise in COVID is now $39,500. Okay, it's still way higher than it was in 2019. Right. But this 3.2% inflation is 3.2% above the COVID inflation. Above the supply chain
price set on top.
Right. Yeah. So the raises that people just got, it's still catch up.
So can I add something to that too?
Yeah, go, Jimmy.
Particularly regarding the restaurant industry, which is something I know a bit about, is that even if inflation was zero right now, and that's still different than deflation, right? And restaurants aren't going to lower their prices. We've just been through a very scary time where margins were greatly compressed before we had to reluctantly raise our prices. We're sure as shit not going to lower them and then all of a sudden see another shoe to drop, seeing all the ridiculousness that just happened and could happen again. So businesses are the only way that prices could go down, a government could make that happen, is get rid of barriers to entry, let there be competition. And if there's ever a period of deflationary where commodity prices come down, so the meat we're buying or the electricity or the power to run our restaurants starts to decline precipitously, then all of a sudden we can compete on price. It starts with specials probably to bring people back in. But independent of those things cratering, this is never going to happen. We're not lowering our prices.
And the last point, Dennis, real quick, just the last point, the last thing my brother said was everyone that I had to give raises to keep, they're not giving me their raises.
They're not giving the money back.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would have to lay them off, which he goes, obviously I gave them raises to keep them, so I'm not laying them off.
For 20 years, when inflation was the ghost that never showed up, I mean, it was boogeyman that just never showed up. Manufacturers and service providers and product makers got really good at finding other ways to be more efficient in the supply line and inventory management just in time. They had all these innovations come in so that instead of raising prices, they still had growth because they resorted to all these other things. I worry that they're learning a bad habit now, and consumers are encouraging the bad habit if we let them get away with raising prices as their first resort instead of going back and cutting staff, making more efficient processes, et cetera. It used to be that they were so reluctant to raise price at all because they got punished for it. But is it easier now because our mindset is changing? And that's what the Fed always does worry about, is that the mindset and expectation of the consumer changes, and then we're flopped.
Yeah. I mean, and I think expectations have become anchored. I think nobody has said, we've raised our price at the restaurant approximately 20%. Many other restaurants have raised their prices more than that, and I've done the research on this too. But there's nobody who says one word about our prices. They understand completely. And I come at it from a little bit of a different angle. Like I believe everyone plays their part in this saga. people should let it be known that if there's a price that's too high, we won't pay it. But in a competitive market, if I'm charging the right price, then they'll pay it. I mean, I guess I don't know what I'm really saying here.
If you raised prices 20%, how much did your costs go up? Really, only like 10%. And you double that, baby.
40. Or
Your
just to
cost-
put it in perspective, Dennis.
Your restaurant went up 40%.
Hell yes, in 3 years. A cooktop that we bought 10 years ago for $6,000. We needed it to replace it last year. The exact same model number, exact same cooktop was $22,000. So, I mean, the notion
shocking.
that was.
I'll give you another example from my brother's place. And I used to have a whole trading card of these. I probably still have them somewhere in this stack of trading cards that I kept with information on them. But essentially, my brother told me, he was texting me every couple of weeks during the spike in inflation. He said, chicken just doubled, chicken just tripled. He makes chicken Parmesan in his restaurant. He uses a lot of chicken. He's like, tomatoes just quadrupled. And he finally came to me and says, so a $30, I may not get the specifics right. Jimmy, you would know better. But he said something to the effect of a $30 case of chicken is now $110. So when
that stayed there though?
Yeah.
No, that didn't stay. No, it didn't stay there. They're linked to commodity prices. But it didn't go back to 30. But those things did happen. And this is one of the reasons I'm talking about. There's no way we're lowering prices because we've seen the shock. We were about to put on an extension to our deck, and that's when lumber prices tripled. So I mean, there's a lot of speculation in this market, particularly when the Fed was injecting shit tons of money into the market, and it showed up in commodities. And our suppliers, we have to bring charts to them saying, yeah, beef now is off 10%. Can we get it for 3% less? And they may say yes. But remember, there's a long chain of prices that nobody wants to budge because everybody was wounded a bit.
Right.
Can I throw, and this has become you interviewing us, Dennis, and that's kind of unfair.
It's fine, by the way.
I want to throw this in the form of a question. So you're gonna find my opinion hidden deep inside this question, which I'm not gonna hide it very much. I have a theory, and I'm asking you guys I'm asking both of you if I'm nuts on this theory. I watched my wife, who I love dearly, last night, as I'm watching this horrible Bears game, scroll through all the cyber deals that she'd missed during the day while she was busy and buy.
Yeah.
All these things that she waited for the sale days to buy. She wanted to buy them for months at a time, but she waited for now.
She actually did wait.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's part of the 12.8 billion in online sales that set a record, or the 9.4, which I think they upgraded to over 10 billion in Black Friday sales that set a record. I wonder how much of it is like, okay, prices finally have been cut. We need to buy today, and then we need to stop again.
Right.
And if that's the case, that will drive your point, I think. Tell me where I'm crazy about how prices, capitalism and competition have to bring prices down. And to Jimmy's point, if stuff's too expensive, they're just not going to buy it. What do you guys think?
Well, 54% of all online purchases on Black Friday were done with mobile. And I think that what your wife did, that scrolling, I think that kind of shopping is a mobile thing especially. It's far easier to do. It's far more instant, and good for her waiting, because it is only by consumers holding back and saying, nope, I'm not going to buy, that these other guys will have to eventually give in, and especially once the largesse of COVID exhausts itself, it'll be anti-inflationary. This is another thing that the media get wrong. Okay. And I remember this. We always say, oh my gosh, gas prices are up. It's going to drive inflation. When I was at Forbes, we did thorough research on 30 years. And then we followed it. I went to CNBC and we copied it there and extended it. And never was there a correlation between higher oil prices and higher inflation, because the higher oil prices then require spending on this thing that doesn't really help the economy at all. You've got to travel. You've got to have warmth, energy, et cetera. And it's sucking out the money that could be spent on plays on Broadway and jet skis and leisurely purchases that really drive, a consumerism, And so
I agree with what Dennis is saying.
Jimmy's brought that up a couple of times on the show.
You kind of disagree though, Bobby. Yes, no?
I did disagree, yes. But go ahead, finish your points.
No, sorry, Dennis. Yeah.
Well, it is true, because I had a guy argue against me on this, and he said, so you're telling me that when the price goes up 30 or 40% for the trucking that delivers most of the food across the U.S., you're saying that's not inflationary? It's going to make the food cost more. But again, food is another necessity. And so those two, the problem for Biden is that the gas pump and the grocery store are the pulse points that Americans see. They're not seeing, stocks and indexes and other data. Those are the two data points, and those data points, they're hurting. And that's why they feel like the economy is so bad, even though we just had 4.9% GDP growth.
So can I think we've hit a couple economic things too, but having you on here, I do want to go back to some talk about the media, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And particularly Elon Musk, particularly him buying Twitter. If you could put, like I have this picture of an overview in my mind that's pharma companies sponsoring the bullshit, the WEF sponsoring the pharma companies sponsoring the WEF, and this unholy group of many things that's controlling media.
Yeah.
Do you believe there's a deep state that's going to be targeting Elon Musk, and that there is already?
I believe that there is already. I have a lot of string on this. So full disclosure, I'm writing a book right now on Elon Musk for HarperCollins.
That's awesome.
I'm totally surfing on top of the Elon Musk book by Walter Isaacson.
Love it.
I'm totally surfing on top of the Breaking Twitter by Ben Mesrich. That's just out because he's a bad man. He's ruined Twitter. So I'm talking to a guy the other day, interviewing him for this book, and he knew Elon when they went to Moscow to look for rockets 20 years ago. And he says, my worry is that someone might put out a hit on this guy, some foreign country that doesn't like what he's done with Starlink, or some deep state thing, or some crazy guy that doesn't like what he tweets or something, But the government is out to get Elon, and the government has 7 different investigations going on with him right now. And I have a couple things. Can I just give you a real rant here? A couple things. Okay.
Of course.
Please.
There's 2 million car accidents in this country every year. There was 33 accidents using full service driving of Tesla, but the NHTSA, the National Highway Safety Transportation Agency Administration, starts a 2-year investigation of the full service driving system because of 33 accidents at the time. Why don't you investigate what you might do to reduce 2 million accidents? No, but let's go out for, you've got the SEC investigating Elon for allegations that he's using company funds to build a glass house for himself. Well, it's got to be a joke set by Elon with a glass house, right? Throwing stones. Furthermore, why do you care, SEC? Why don't you let shareholders decide about that? Why is this a matter for you? You got Elizabeth Warren calling up for the Department of Defense and State Department to investigate Elon for his Starlink management because he refused to turn on the network to allow Ukrainian submarine drones to end up attacking Russian ships that were in harbor, when it turns out, well, no, actually, he was following U.S. law that says that's a sanctioned area. You're not allowed to turn on the star. So they went after him for that. You've got, they're going after an old FTC investigation because 10 years ago, Twitter agreed, okay, we'll be more careful with consumer data. And then like 3 ex-employees complained and said, they're being not careful with consumer data after Tesla. So now they're investigating on a 10-year-old thing. We've got, SpaceX gets 1 million applications per year. One guy with citizenship in Canada and France applies. And he ends up, after he's brought on for a second interview online, etc. But then it turns out emails show he answered a bad question about his reasons for wanting to be there, and he wasn't very creative. So they pass and they don't fill the job at all. The one guy out of 1 million applications to SpaceX files a complaint with the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, and now they have a new case against them because you may be discriminating in the hiring of refugees, even though their contracts with NASA says you cannot hire foreigners. So the government's coming at him from all sides, messing with him. And I've got a chapter where I talk about that. And you know what Elon's lesson, you know what his approach is? You know what? When you're the highest nail, you get pounded down first. So strap on a helmet. This guy is saying, fluff you, bring it. And he's going to beat him. And I believe in him. And I think government is out to get him. And Joe Biden, one day after the midterm elections, was asked at a press conference, clearly a setup question because of the way it was phrased and what his answer was. And a reporter says, given Elon Musk taking over Twitter and the presence of foreign investors in the deal, because, Prince Alaweed, who was investing in dozens of U.S. companies, is one of his investors, and a sovereign wealth fund. Give me a break. How concerned are you? Should he be investigated? And Biden pauses and says, looking at her like, you rascal, you. Well, I'm not saying he did anything wrong. But yes, it should be investigated. And when you are a president, you say, I'm not saying he did anything wrong. You are saying he did. I am saying he did something wrong. That's what he did. And so and if you are an ambitious bureaucrat, you saw Biden say that the day after the 2022 midterm victories for the Democrats. If you have any ambition at all, go after Elon Musk. And that's what they're all trying to do.
Well, why are you so convinced he's going to win? What if they do silence him? Then what happens to us, people like us?
Okay, I'm convinced he's going to win for several reasons. The biggest reason is because that man has his own strength and self-belief, and he has been pursuing his dreams for more than 20 years with persistence and patience and doggedness and never wavering. He was giving a lecture to a guy I talked to who met him like more than 20 years ago, where he said, SpaceX, he said carbon, green, and electric cars, and free speech. Free speech was part of that, even that long ago. He spent $44 billion on a platform now worth less than $20 billion because he felt like it was that important. And today it is the only platform that will not bow to government censors. Government is in there at Facebook and every other platform interfering against and in violation of the First Amendment, which the U.S. Supreme Court by next year will take up a case and may rule on that. It's been shameful. So one reason Elon is not going to lose is because of his own strength and his own vision. Another reason is because he now owns the most powerful media platform the world has ever seen. The New York Times, which led the way for coverage for everyone else in the world, at most has a reach of 2 million. He has 550 million monthly visitors on that platform. And the third and final reason is the guy's incredibly brilliant. He's worth $200 billion. They're not going to be able to crush him no matter how hard they try.
It's just amazing when you talk about it. And I worry quite a bit about this because it's the only place that we can still, question. When you said something about the First Amendment, about freedom of speech, and all these know-it-alls be out there, freedom of speech is a government, and Meta's a private company. Bullshit. Meta has the emails prove it. The federal government was leaning on them, leaning on Twitter to try to censor things. 51 different intelligence officers signed that thing about the Russian disinformation bullshit about the Hunter Biden laptop.
Shameful.
And it's so funny. I have liberal friends who was like, they're like, wow, that wouldn't have made a difference anyway. Like, I'm not saying it would have made a difference. They are saying it would have made a difference or could potentially make a difference. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bent over backwards and done whatever sort of somersaults to stifle it. Correct?
One survey found 16% of Democrats said they would have changed their vote if they had known about the laptop. And
so it's a rigged election.
Yeah. Right. Wow, you had a lot there, and I had so many good things to say back, and now I've just forgotten all of them.
That's what we do at our age. We blank out all the time. I walk into a room all the time, like, what did I come in here for?
So it's because we have so much important information crowding out
so much
important information. But on the Twitter files and on the censorship and all that stuff, government didn't just come in. This is what troubled me about it is, and by the way, it is fine for a privately owned platform like Twitter to say, you know what, we hate conservatives, we're going to censor them. The problem is that the FBI led the way. The problem is that Stanford University set up a beard organization, the Election Integrity Project, and government funneled the requests through there, and they go to these platforms. They were having meetings with them. Laura Loomer is this independent journalist on Twitter who just reported a week or two ago saying, all of the top media company executives met with intelligence officers somewhere in Mexico talking about 2024 election coverage. Where is the media on that, checking that out? I kept wondering. Here's the thing, guys. I wrote something like more than 15 columns about the Twitter files revelations for TruthDow.news, for Newsmax, a couple for the Wall Street Journal. I wrote more about the Twitter files than the New York Times and the Washington Post entire staffs combined. Why aren't you guys outraged about government censoring voices? And they didn't just censor conservative voices. They said, hey, you see this voice? We like this little account with 100 followers. Play up his message and get him listened to more. Oh, and this joke about Fauci, that is will lead to vaccine hesitation. So get rid of that joke. I mean, and get rid of this valid scientific paper. So they weren't going after terrorists, criminals. people planning riots. They were going after people saying stuff that they didn't like, and government's not allowed to do that. Now, we had a great First Amendment lawyer who's handled almost 300 cases, Tom Julin in Miami. We were on the college paper together, and this guy's handled First Amendment cases for the media all his career. And he says, you're wrong, Dennis. Government has a First Amendment right to go into those platforms and saying, hey, man, you're printing bad stuff. We don't want you doing that because government has a right. And I said, no. Then let government instead put out more speech of its own, put out a platform, get on and open up more accounts that say U.S. government and put out more speech. Don't restrain my speech because
I'll go so far as to say, I'll go so far as saying, I know, Bobby, it's your question, but I'll go so far as saying there's never been an instance of a government since the year 1100 that was involved in misinformation that wasn't themselves the purveyors of the propaganda. They are the pushers of the propaganda. And when they hired that crazy woman who was singing on YouTube to be the head of the misinformation department, that was the most ridiculous. It was like we were living in a dystopian nightmare.
Yeah. And what's happened is they're getting away with it now because the media aren't calling them out and saying, what are you doing? What are you saying? And here's where the problem began. About 10 years ago, with the rise of social media, we began hearing this phrase, harmful content. Now, here's my problem with that phrase. First of all, words on a screen, words on a page, images cannot leap off and smack me in the face. They cannot be harmful. I have to decide whether I'm going to let it harm me. I have to decide whether to read it. But once we decide that content can be harmful, well, then we need a safe space. Well, then we have to protect you from this harmful content. How about you let me protect myself by deciding to change a channel and not watch it? So all of this fake, phony government intent to protect me is purely aimed at silencing me and muzzling me and silencing the voices that I have a right to hear. And as you can tell, it's what's bugging me.
Yeah, it's two things to me. Number one, social media, and I'm stealing a little bit of this from Mike Tyson, but social media has made people way too comfortable to be able to say things without the threat of getting punched in the face.
Keyboard courage.
Yeah, the keyboard. Yeah, I mean, just to me, that's a thing. And then you get harmed by words because people say words that they would never say if you were in the same room.
But also, you're letting yourself be harmed, and that makes you a pussy, okay? If you're letting yourself be harmed,
log off, jackass.
Yeah.
Right.
Stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. We forgot that this is where young people are wimpy. They cringe at the slightest conflict. Man, stand up. And here's one more thing I got for you on this: is watch for this. There's a fear meme going around everywhere. So FBI agents are called to testify in Congress. And the boss, Ray, says, we can't have them testify. There's been emailed threats and they're afraid. So we're going to not testify. There's a lot of people giving into, well, they would do it, but there's threats. So they're not going to do it because they're afraid. And it's kind of January 6th insurrection, right? I mean, what are you so afraid of? Stand up, courage. It used to be, we stood up, we overcame fear. Now I see officials everywhere canceling things, not doing things because, we've received some threats, so we're afraid. They're not really afraid at all. They want us to think they're afraid because they want us to be afraid of the thing that they're citing.
So what do we do, both you guys? What do we do to try to right the ship?
Well, the first thing I would say is you have to convince people that when you're talking the way the three of us are talking, it's not about a Republican Party.
It's not at all.
Because the first thing they do is they say, you Trumpers, you MAGA, you Republicans. I'm like, slow down. You have no idea who I voted for, who I would vote for. This is an American thing. We used to actually be able to all be Americans and then argue about the details of maybe what that meant or what the better path was, but we still agreed we all were. There was no time in my childhood where you'd have seen American flag torn down and replaced with any flag during any protests. I'm not even saying which flags because I don't know if they were both done. They may have both been done.
Survive doing that without taking
exactly. Again, so to me, the first thing you have to, and Jimmy does this all the time on social media, and I credit him for this. So he'll say something conservative-ish, and someone will always say, "Well, you and Trump and this." He goes, "I didn't mention Republican or Trump at all. I just said this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing, and we can argue that point, but you can't tell me who I voted for or what party I belong to based on that." That to me is the biggest point.
And what I would add to all that, I've got this kind of slogan on the podcast, What's Bugging Me? Stand up, fight back, be heard. Now for the less pushy people, stand up and push back and be heard. And so part of it, though, I think so many of us, the silent majority, so afraid of getting canceled, so afraid of being called racist if we say that Kamala Harris is a bad vice president. She's a terrible vice president, but then that makes you both racist and sexist. So, 40% of Americans in a First Amendment poll taken annually for 20 years, 40% now say they're afraid of speaking up because they might get canceled. 60% don't understand that the First Amendment covers books, movies, poetry, TV shows. They don't even know that. 1/3 of America believes that stopping and preventing hate speech is more important than ensuring free speech. Another third of America, not sure where they stand on that, which means they're weak and they don't understand that we've got to allow the most hateful speech that we dislike so that we can have free speech for the rest of us and never have it taken away. So, but more of us have to stand up and start telling our friends and start telling other people and say, wait a minute, you know what? There's another side to that. I think we have to start speaking up. And if we get canceled, then so be it. I mean, I'm known. I'm not anonymous online. I'm not, hiding my opinions. Neither is Jimmy I there. I mean, I stand up and be heard. Nikki Haley just got in all kinds of trouble for talking about that anonymity thing and that everyone should have to register. So she's right, but she's wrong. She's wrong. Government can't impose that. That does restrain free speech. But I think that private platforms should. It's why Elon wants to have verified users who pay, because a bot can't have a credit card. And anonymity is an evil on the internet, and people are much more well-behaved if they know they can be held accountable for what they say and what they do, right? Yeah. And so more accountability and more standing up and being heard.
Which is, and I like the way you put it about about Nikki Haley being right and being wrong all at the same time. Like I'm against that. I understand where it comes from. And I'm going to add something too, but I know we got to let you go soon or we could have you all day. You said about hate speech. I'm even going to go toward hate crimes. Like I have a brother who's gay. He's been gay his whole life. I've been his brother, whatever. If someone commits a crime against him because he's gay, the last thing I'm going to give a shit about is what that guy's motivation was. That guy's going to get punished. And I wish the law would think that too. It's almost like giving credit to these hateful, racist, bullshit, anti-Semitic, anti-gay. If you murder someone, you murdered someone. I don't want to give you credit for, and I know that if it's a hate crime, it's a greater punishment. But even so, I don't want to get into your head. You're just a piece of shit. Does that make any sense to you at all or no?
Really, if I could, what it really does is it makes it as if the murder of your neighbor for driving on your lawn was somehow not as bad
as the
murder of your black neighbor because you don't like black people, or your white neighbor because it's absolutely ridiculous. They're both horrendous.
But let's understand that the whole concept of hate crime in America is an oversold story. And here's some real data. If you look at actual criminal offenses in a country of 340 million people, it is 8,000 hate crimes per year. Blacks are most of those. They talk about the rise of Islamophobia, the scourge. For too many years, the Biden administration just declared a new national strategy to combat Islamophobia. How many attacks on Muslims last year? 158. It's a rate per 100,000 Muslims of only fewer than 4 cases per year. Jews have triple that. They have 15 cases per 100,000, 1,122 hate crimes. Now, let's expand the definition of hate crime to hate offenses that aren't criminal. 250,000 a year. In a country of 340 million people, in a country of, I think it's 175 million people of color, minorities and immigrants, etc. Okay, 250,000 a year. Turns out 99% of them are words. Hey, name. Hey, you N-word. Hey, you C-word. It's names. It's who cares? Some guy you don't even know, calls a name. Now, it's easy for me to say because I'm white. I don't know what that's like. Actually, everybody's, a target. I'm just saying, don't let it hurt you. And I'm saying, I think the whole thing's a little oversold. And the Islamophobia thing is ridiculously oversold.
Damn straight.
It's funny that attack on the Islamophobic attacks, that's Memorial Day weekend in Chicago. That's not many at all.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, all the pro-Palestinian protests in America, it turns out the Washington Examiner is a guy there I had on the podcast named Gabe Kaminsky. He's this young reporter. He's in one of his first jobs out of school, a few years. Okay, where's the Washington Post and New York Times on this? He's got these protests being the biggest protest in history, pro-Palestinian, 300,000 people, Washington D.C. in early November, and it was funded by these groups that are funded themselves by terrorist sympathizer organizations, by Hamas supporters, and that's who's making this happen. And even the Chinese Communist Party had funding into some of the groups that were sponsoring these protests. This is not just Israel versus
follow the
Palestine.
money.
This is Iran and Russia and China trying to foment to get America, to wipe out America. This is the ultimate goal. And the media aren't seeing it. And the ridiculous liberals are marching, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And basically, to do that right after the Hamas attacks, can you imagine if hundreds of thousands of people marched in the days after 9/11 and did these pro-Palestinian marches that are just celebrating the attack that just happened? That just happened. And it shows you how far we've come in 20 years and how we've really got to put a stop to this. We got to start standing up and being heard.
All right, you want to call it?
Yeah.
Dennis, thank you so much for being on. Tell people how to find you real quick before we go. On Twitter, what's your handle?
Yeah, on Twitter, at Dennis Kneale. It's a Kneale, guys. And then what's bugging me? And you'll find out it's a lot. Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking to both of you. And I hope, Bob, you'll come on, and Jim, come on again soon on What's Bugging Me.
Right? Absolutely.
No doubt about it.